Okay, so we're diving into some pretty major legal changes happening right now, stuff that usually flies under the radar, but this is big. Judicial reform in Mexico. And not just like small tweaks, this is like a whole reshaping of how things work.
Yeah, you're right. It's huge.
Imagine a system where, like, instead of politicians choosing judges, it's the people directly electing them.
It's a pretty radical shift.
That's the level we're talking about here, and we're going deep on it today.
And what makes it even more significant, I think, is that these aren't just proposals. This isn't just talk. We're talking about official decrees printed in the Diario Oficial de la Federación, the DOF.
Okay, so the DOF, for those of us who...
It's essentially Mexico's version of the Federal Register. It's where laws become, set in stone.
So this is the law of the land now. No more hypotheticals.
Exactly. This is happening.
And one of the biggest changes, definitely, is this whole thing with citizens electing judges. We're talking Supreme Court justices, those on circuit courts, even district judges.
Right. So those circuit courts, by the way, they're the appellate level just below the Supreme Court. Important to know.
So like one step below the top.
Yeah.
Got it. But still, that's giving people a lot of power.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge step towards, I'd say, a more direct democracy. See, historically, these appointments, they were always seen as political.
Oh, yeah.
Backroom deals, favors, all that eroded public trust.
For sure.
But now, this has the potential to completely change that.
Yeah.
When citizens choose, it creates a whole new level of accountability.
Accountability. Right. Because if a judge knows they have to answer to the people who elected them.
Exactly. Imagine Supreme Court justice campaigns.
Yeah.
Debates, the whole 9 yards.
Wild. It'd be like a presidential election, but for judges.
Exactly.
I can see how that would definitely change how people view the courts. Like maybe even restore some faith in the system,
It's the hope, right?
But it's not all sunshine and roses, is it? There's got to be downsides. I mean, what's to stop campaign donations from influencing rulings? Or even just like public opinion swaying things.
Yeah, you've hit on probably the biggest question mark here. Will this lead to a judiciary that's more responsive, more in tune with the people? Or will it open the door to, I don't know, maybe some ethical dilemmas?
Right, it's uncharted territory.
Completely. We're going to have to see how this plays out.
Speaking of new ground, another big change is term limits. 12 years with the Supreme Court, that's it. One term, done. Lower courts get 9, but they can be reelected.
Right, so it's a balancing act. With the Supreme Court, they're going for fresh perspectives.
Yeah.
Right. They don't want any single judge or even a single way of thinking about the law to have too much influence for too long.
Makes sense. But on the other hand, don't you lose something when someone's that experienced leaves?
For sure. There's the potential loss of, institutional knowledge, especially with those cases that drag on forever. You need someone who knows the ins and outs.
Oh, totally. Some of these legal battles go on for years.
Exactly. And that's where the lower courts, with the re-election thing, come in. Judges who might run again, they're going to be thinking about their record.
Ooh, interesting. So they'll be campaigning on, I'm tough on crime or whatever.
Potentially, yeah. Re-elect Judge Garcia, he's fair but firm, that sort of thing.
Wow, that's wild. So it could lead to a more, localized approach to justice.
Maybe. Or it could create a whole new set of, complications. It's really a bold experiment.
It really is. And it's not just about choosing judges, is it? It's about keeping them in check once they're there. That's where this Tribunal of Discipline Judicial comes in, right?
The TDJ. Yeah, this is where Mexico's getting serious about corruption in the judiciary. It's a whole independent body, also elected, by the way.
Oh, so the people choose them too.
Yep, and they've got the power to investigate any allegations of misconduct, and if they have to, they can impose some serious sanctions.
So we're not talking a slap on the wrist here.
No, this TDJ. They can even initiate the removal of judges, even Supreme Court justices.
Wait, hold on. The ones elected by the whole country can be removed from office.
That's right. The process itself for removing them is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But the fact that this TDJ can start that process, that's huge. It's sending a very clear message. Nobody's above the law here.
Wow. Mexico's really putting its foot down with this reform. But let's move on, maybe talk about the speed of trials.
Okay, sure.
We all know that justice delayed is justice denied, or however that saying goes. Sounds like Mexico's trying to speed things up a bit.
They are. One of the biggest things they've done is put a 6-month deadline on certain cases, particularly things like, tax disputes, stuff where a fast resolution is really important.
6 months. That's ambitious.
The goal is to tackle that backlog of cases, make sure people aren't waiting years for a resolution, improve access to justice overall.
I mean, 6 months is fast. really fast. I
Yeah.
can't imagine trying to gather evidence, find witnesses, all that in just 6 months, especially for a complicated legal case.
Yeah, you've got a point. While the goal of making things faster is good, you're right, it's got to be implemented carefully.
Otherwise, it's just going to be a rush to judgment.
Exactly. And that defeats the whole purpose.
Totally. Plus, think of all the resources that'll take. You'd need more judges, more staff, more money for everything.
For sure. It'll be interesting to see how they handle that side of things.
It's like they're trying to rebuild the car while it's still running.
Right. It's going to be a bumpy ride for sure.
Speaking of which, let's talk about how the judicial branch itself is going to be managed.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets interesting.
Lay it on me.
They're setting up a whole new administrative body. The Órgano de Administración Judicial. A mouthful, I know.
It's all right. We're all friends here.
Anyway, this body will be responsible for the day-to-day operations, the nitty-gritty.
And who gets to call the shots?
It's split into 3 parts. One part is appointed by the president,
Okay.
one part by the Senate,
All right.
and one part by the Supreme Court itself.
So you've got the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, all with their fingers in the pie. What could go wrong?
Right. It's designed to be a system of checks and balances, you see.
Yeah.
Promote transparency, all that good stuff.
I guess that makes sense in theory. But you gotta think, with that many cooks in the kitchen, won't it just slow everything down?
It could. Or it could create a whole bunch of infighting.
Or both. Who knows? Only time will tell, I guess.
That's the truth. And speaking of unique situations, this reform also has a whole section just for Mexico City, you know?
Oh, right. Article 122. Why does Mexico City get special treatment? It's just one city, isn't it?
Well, it's not just ANY City, it's Mexico City. It's got a unique status, legally speaking. Kind of like a city-state, almost.
So it has its own laws, separate from the rest of the country?
In a way, yeah. It's got its own legal framework, so the reform has to take that into account,
So they're basically making a tailor-made version of the reform just for Mexico City.
basically. Which goes to show just how complicated it is to implement something this big, this sweeping, across an entire country.
Totally. What works in one place might not work somewhere else, right?
Exactly. It's a good reminder that no matter how well-intentioned a reform might be, putting it into practice is a whole other story.
A whole other story indeed. And we're just getting started. We've only scratched the surface of this massive change to Mexico's legal system. Stick around, we'll be right back. We're back and ready to go even deeper on this Mexican judicial reform. We've talked a lot about the structures and the systems, the technical stuff.
Illegal nuts and bolts.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, what does all this mean for the average person in Mexico? Someone who actually has to, use the legal system.
That's the real test, isn't it? It's easy to get caught up in the abstract,
Yeah.
but how this impacts people's lives, that's what matters.
100%. So let's say, I don't know, you're someone in Mexico who needs to deal with the courts for some reason. What's different for you now?
Well, I'd say one of the biggest potential changes is increased access to justice. Hopefully.
Okay, how so?
With a more transparent system, one that's more accountable. The hope is that people will feel more comfortable engaging with it, less intimidated.
Yeah, it's less like, oh no, the courts, and more like, okay, this is a system I can work with.
Right. It's about shifting that whole perception from something that felt opaque and kind of scary to one that's more open, more responsive to the people it's supposed to serve.
It all comes down to trust, doesn't it? If you believe the system is fair, you're more likely to use it.
Exactly. But it's a two-way street,
Oh, how so?
This reform, it asks more of citizens, too. It's not just about showing up to vote every few years.
What else does it require?
Engagement. People need to stay informed. They need to understand the legal issues at play. They have to be active participants in their own cases.
It's almost like this reform is pushing for a more legally literate society.
It kind of is. For it to work, people can't just know their rights. They need to understand the whole system, how it functions, how to navigate it.
It's about empowerment, right? Not just being a passive observer, but being able to advocate for yourself.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Speaking of knowledge, what about access to legal representation itself? Can everyone afford a good lawyer, especially now with all these changes?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a huge one.
Yeah.
The reform itself doesn't explicitly address that, but it creates a situation where the demand for good legal help is definitely going to increase. As more people engage with the system, you're going to need more lawyers who really know their stuff, especially lawyers who understand all the ins and outs of this new system.
So it's not just about reforming the courts, it's about making sure the entire system around it can actually support this new way of doing things.
Exactly. Bridging that access to justice gap. Well, it's a challenge everywhere, not just in Mexico. But this reform really shines a light on it, making sure everyone, rich or poor, can get good legal representation. That's vital.
Couldn't agree more. Now, we touched on the speed of trials earlier, and there's one area where it seems like things are going to be quite different. Article 122, which deals specifically with Mexico City. What's the deal with that? Why does the capital get its own section?
Ah, yes. Mexico City, it's a bit of a special case. See, it's not just another city within a state. It operates under a totally different framework,
So it's like its own entity?
basically. You can almost think of it like a city-state, with its own set of rules and regulations, separate from any particular state.
Okay, so a one-size-fits-all approach to judicial reform wouldn't really work there.
Exactly. And that's where Article 122 comes in. It's all about adapting those national changes to fit Mexico City's unique context.
So they're basically customizing the reform.
Precisely. Which just goes to show, again, how complex this whole thing is. Implementing a reform this big across an entire country with all its regional differences, it's a huge undertaking.
It's like a giant puzzle, isn't it? All these moving parts trying to get them to fit together.
And as with any puzzle, there are bound to be some hiccups along the way. But one thing is certain. Mexico is embarking on a truly fascinating experiment in judicial reform, and the outcome is far from certain.
And we're back for our final look at the massive changes happening in the Mexican judicial system. We've gone through a lot, haven't we?
We really have. It's been quite the deep dive.
From actually electing judges to term limits, that whole TDJ thing, even how this is all going to work in Mexico City, which is a whole other ballgame.
It's a lot to keep track of, but it's important stuff.
Yeah.
This is going to have a real impact.
Exactly. So as we wrap things up, let's zoom out a bit. Big picture time. What do you think? What's the long-term effect of all this going to be? What's Mexico really going for here?
Well, to me, it seems like it's about more than just changing laws. It's about changing how people see the justice system itself.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay. Explain that.
right now, I think for a lot of people, the courts, judges, all that, it feels distant, untouchable, maybe even a little bit scary, you know?
Oh, for sure.
But this is about making it more transparent, more accountable,
Yeah.
and hopefully making it feel more democratic.
So it's about giving people a voice, a say in how justice is done.
Exactly. Instead of this big, imposing institution, it becomes something that belongs to the people.
It's like they're breaking down those walls,
Right.
making it less intimidating.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But it's going to take time, right? This is just the first step. You can change the rules on paper, but changing the culture around those rules, that takes longer.
So it's about education, changing how people view the law itself, their role in it.
Precisely. And that doesn't happen overnight. It'll
Yeah.
be interesting to see how they approach that.
Totally. It's a huge experiment, this whole thing. No guarantee it'll work. But one thing's for sure, Mexico's definitely trying something bold here.
No doubt about it. And you know what? The rest of the world's watching.
Oh, you think so? Why is that?
Sure. A lot of countries are struggling with these same questions, right? Transparency, accountability, access to justice. They'll be looking to see what happens here, what works, what doesn't.
So it's like Mexico's setting off on this new path, and the whole world's kind of along for the ride.
In a way, yeah. And I, for one, am very curious to see where it leads.
Well said. And as the story unfolds, we'll be here to break it down, analyze it, make sense of it all.
It's a story that's just beginning, that's for sure.
It certainly is. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. A huge thank you to you. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into, well, who knows what, something fascinating, hopefully. Until then, keep asking questions and keep exploring.